Tēnā koutou, everybody. My clock says 1 o'clock. So we'll kick off this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us all. So this webinar, as I'm sure Gareth is going to talk about shortly, is about cataloguing archival audio material in no less than 8 Indigenous languages. And he's reporting back on his visit to the Northwest Territories in Canada. So Gareth, we're very pleased that Gareth was a recipient of the Paul Reynolds No Numpties grant, which I think has got the best name of all of our grants from LIANZA. So Gareth has been working at Aotearoa for, it must be about 4 years now, Gareth. So he, with his grant, he visited Canada, and he went to a First Nations language gathering. Anyway, I'll let Gareth talk more about that. In fact, I'll just shut up now and let Gareth talk about what he's going to, how he's going to run the webinar, and I believe that there's going to be time for questions afterwards. So over to you, Gareth.
Tēnā koe Helen, o tira tēnā hoki koutou. Tēnā koutou e noho atura I roto I o koutou kāinga o tātou kāinga maha, huri noa I te Aotearoa. Te hiku, te tonga, ngā parirau kei Wainganui. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. I'll be talking for about 25 minutes to 30 minutes about the kaupapa, about the visit to Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan in June last year, and then we'll be opening up for questions at the end of the webinar. So I'll go straight to the PowerPoint that I have prepared for today. Give me one moment. Everybody can see that? If you can't see the webinar, please let me know. So this is the kaupapa. It's about an Indigenous archiving project in the Northwest Territories in Canada and other territories as well, which I'll explain as I'm talking through this presentation. And again, I'd like to acknowledge the LIANZA and other sponsors for the Paul Reynolds No Numpties Scholarship, of which I was a recipient last year. These are the hosts. I was warmly welcomed by the hosts of the Indigenous Archiving Project. It's based in the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. But this particular office is in Yellowknife, which is in the Northwest Territories of Canada. You'll recall that this photo was taken in the days when people used to work in offices. This photo is a couple of years old. It's the cataloguing team in Yellowknife. I wanted to talk about where we were. I whia mātou. It wasn't until I arrived in Yellowknife that I really got a sense of being at the top of the world. Yellowknife, if you look at the purple area in Canada, in the Arctic, near the Arctic Circle, those two lakes there in the purple area, the one on the right, the northernmost one, is where Yellowknife is based. So I got a sense while I was there of who the neighbours are. So people talked about Alaska, Russia, Greenland, and the Arctic Circle as if it was in the sort of geographic neighbourhood. There was, I picked up a little anecdote that during the Cold War, Alaska and Russia were cut off from each other for 50 years or so. You can see how close they are up at the top of the map there. When the Cold War finished and the Indigenous peoples of those areas were able to get together again and to meet with one another, they found that, and they were reminded that they sing the same waiata, they speak the same language, and it was collectively there's a whole lot of connections and whole Indigenous worldview pertaining to this part of the world. So this is where the project is based: Northwest Territories, Yellowknife, and the north of Canada. In Yellowknife, there is the headquarters for CBC North. CBC is a state broadcaster. It has 20 local CBC networks, and CBC North is one of them. So within this building, they produce radio, TV news programs. On the left, upstairs, you can see where the cataloguers are based, where that photo was taken. On the right-hand side, upstairs, you've got all the producers and the presenters. About at least 50 people in the building. It's quite a few people that work there. The studios and all the production happens downstairs. I stood in on one program. It was like a Te Karere type program, an indigenous news TV program. The presenter was 3,000 k's away. The program was being broadcast from the Yellowknife studios. The teleprompter was in English. It was in English, and she was reading in her own indigenous language. And what I observed was that she was live translating. They didn't have the capacity to translate the teleprompt text from English into the indigenous language. So that was quite a feat, really quite a skill to professionally present the news while live translating as well. I thought that was pretty amazing. One thing about Yellowknife, it was minus 19 degrees on this day. It was pretty cold. It was cold that I wasn't used to. Te kinohoki o te maeke. Although I would note that one of the anecdotes from one of the locals was that generally in winter, historically, it's common to get as low as 40 degrees for the temperature to be in the low 40s. That's not happening as much anymore. As a result of that, of the weather warming to around minus 20 degrees, minus 10 degrees in winter, the ice is melting, and just that little anecdote about the environment has got implications for us all. They're feeling the effects of global warming in the far north of Canada. So where I was in Dene lands. I got to visit the office of the Dene First Nation in Yellowknife. That's the tangata whenua of the area that I was in. I got to visit their office, and at the back of their office, they've got a great big indigenous archive, their tribal archive. They face similar challenges to archives in a lot of places. They invest a significant resource in actually storing all of their documentation and a little bit of audio-visual taonga. They've got a huge backlog of taonga that need to be arranged, sorted through, even digitised where they've got audio-visual taonga. So like a lot of archives, they're looking for resources to help to achieve that goal of theirs. So tangata whenua, the Dene First Nation. CBC project. This Indigenous archiving project that I visited is quite a significant project. It's got 75,000 hours of analogue audio to digitise, to sort, to identify the languages involved, and to catalogue and eventually distribute. You'll see the list of languages that are present in the project. I won't even try to pronounce all of those languages because it was a bit overwhelming, the names, the peoples, to actually learn and to absorb all of that information in about a week or so was quite a challenge. It got me thinking about how when visitors and our indigenous manukiri come from overseas and come to Aotearoa, what a challenge it must be for them just to learn the name of one iwi, or one location or a bunch of locations in iwi that they might interact with. It's when you're not familiar with the languages, with the forms of the language, it's really challenging. And there's a photo here of Susie. Susie is one of the cataloguing team that I was fortunate enough to meet. She's from Nunavut, which I understand is a territory of Canada are under indigenous control. It sits within the CBC North rohe and is one of the languages that is part of this project. So there's 8. There's content from 75,000 hours of analogue audio that's being digitised, catalogued, and it involves content from all of these 8 languages. Not sure if any of those names are familiar with people. In the Northwest Territories, there are 9 official Indigenous languages, including English and French. English and French are the sort of de facto national Indigenous languages. And then in the Northwest Territories, you've got that dynamic of additional, of the Indigenous languages having legal status as well. This is a trilingual sign. It's in English, in Dene, apologies for mispronunciation, and in French. You'll see that it is, can everybody see the whole sign, or is it obscured by, or is it visible to everybody, the whole sign? Helen?
It's fine for me.
Sorry, Gareth, just unmuting myself. You can see the down to the bottom. You can see the time and a little bit of some different languages. Yeah,
you can see there that in this sign, it's in English at the top. It's in Dene in the middle, and then in French. So my interpretation here is that NWT in French is TNO, which must stand for Northwestern Territories in French. The project is based in Northwest Territories, in Northern Quebec, and in Nunavut country, which is, those are 2 territories in the northern part of Quebec. This is the team. This photo here is of the Montreal cataloguing team on the left, and the team that hosted me over in Yellowknife. This photo was taken a couple of years ago. The Montreal team is responsible for content in the northern area of Quebec, and then just north of there, you cross over the sea to Nunavut country. The Yellowknife team, it was interesting to note, they sit on the same level as all the TV and radio production people who are on the other side of the building. But because we're multi-talented Indigenous people, and also because of capacity issues, it wasn't unusual for one of the cataloguers to be pulled over into the production site to stand in for a presenter, Indigenous presenter that was away. So they were multitasking. So like Māori speakers in a lot of organisations, we get to work across areas, going across here in CBC to present a television program for a couple of days because their colleague / relation is on leave. That wasn't unusual. The team is based in, I want to give a little bit of background information about the team. So if you think of Yellowknife as the capital city of Northwest Territories, population of 20,000, of a total population in the territory of 44,000, half of that population is Indigenous. So around half the population of Yellowknife is Indigenous. So the team members themselves are from small communities right through Nunavut, right through Northwest Territories and Northern Quebec. And the communities are all relatively small. So because they're small, the people are, the cataloguing team are all rooted in their communities. They know their communities, they know their people, they were raised there. I wanted to give a little anecdote about a movie that I went to on the first night that I arrived at Yellowknife. There was a film festival with a whole lot of Indigenous movies. It was really good timing. I got there at lunchtime. By 7 o'clock, I had been taken across to the movie theatre to watch an Indigenous movie, Nahani, River of Forgiveness. There was a whole lot of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the screening. There was a panel that spoke afterwards to talk about how this journey by the local people down the river to reconnect with the whenua, to reconnect with their culture, was life-changing. And of course, my host who took me to the movie that night, Jim, was actually from Fort Simpson, where the movie is based. He was able to give me the sort of inside story about Te Awa or Nahani, the moose skin culture, the culture and tradition of the people of making waka out of moose skins. That was one of the challenges of the movie that was described in the movie, of revitalizing moose skin waka culture. And it was a real privilege to be able to connect to this movie through one of the cataloguers. So the cataloguers were part of the community, rooted in the community. They know the people and the language. This is Mary Mulguguk. Apologies for mispronunciation there. Mary here is showing me the cataloguing workflow of sourcing the digital files, working with them, cataloguing them, and then sending them to the next stage. You can see that she's got what I think is an indigenous dictionary on her desk, a dictionary for her language. Some of the cataloguers had dictionaries for their language, but not all of them are at the same stage of research and development. Some of the languages have dictionaries, some of them don't. Some of them have set writing styles, some of them don't. And I'll talk about that a little bit more through the presentation. And of course, all of the cataloguers were aware of the role that their project has in language revitalisation right through the areas that the project covers. This slide is about the project infrastructure, and I want you to think sort of Canada-wide. Canada is like Australia in size. That's the best analogy that I can use. So there's an automated digitisation kaupapa that works through the backlog in Toronto. That meant removing or moving the material from the Northwest Territories to the other side of the country to Toronto, where it's being automatically digitised. The files then become available across the ICT network of CBC, so I imagine that that'd be accessible anywhere across Canada, the CBC network. The cataloguing manager is in Toronto, and this pānui here that I saw on the wall where you can ring along with any cataloguing questions. I just wondered what sort of challenge that would bring, where your training, your advice would be sought from someone in a different time zone, probably a couple of time zones away. So these are some of the dynamics that the CBC project involves, that are involved with this project, from Quebec, through to Toronto, through to Yellowknife. It's a project that's happening right across the country. Some observations. So I've got some observations about the program, but also about culture as well. You can see a taruke here in the Yellowknife Museum. So I saw this and I thought, oh, that's a taruke. And it just pointed to the similarities that we have in our material cultures and our traditions. All of the kōrero that I had with the team really reinforced how similar our cultures and our peoples are. So as a team and as a project, it was critical that they have an awareness of the knowledge of the people, of their kaumātua, and the understanding of their kōrero tiku iho. And the little visit that we made to the museum really reinforced this, that there's so much that we have in common as indigenous cultures, right through to having shared kai. So of course on day 2 or 3, wouldn't be an indigenous experience without having shared kai. It's hard for me to contribute because I obviously can't take anything through customs. So the best I could do was go to the petrol station across the road and bring my own contribution. This is Arctic fish. There was raw moose meat was another first. But in the kōrero, we talked about our stories, we talked about our traditions, and here are a couple of questions that were pitched to me from the team. Do we have patu paiarehe? They didn't ask if we have patu paiarehe here in Te Ao Māori, but they basically described patu paiarehe, spiritual beings, and we were able to exchange stories and anecdotes from that point of view. Another question, do we eat kangaroo? How close? And then I just gave them a little geography lesson about how, we don't eat kangaroo, but that's our huanga, our indigenous whānau just across the water. Some more observations about the cataloguing. This screenshot here isn't so much about the cataloguing project per se, but it's about broadcasting output by CBC. It is what I understand is Inuktitut language, obviously uses a non-Roman script, and it's on the CBC website. So on the CBC website, they've posted a news story, and it's in the language of the Nunavut people, as I understand it. How does that impact on cataloguing when you're using non-Roman script, the script that we are used to here in Aotearoa? So to further describe the dynamics of the project, it's working in 8 indigenous languages. Some of the languages use non-Roman scripts. I understand that some of them do use Roman scripts. Some of the languages are using relatively new writing systems. So they're still working through some of the consistencies and inconsistencies of the way that they document their language. There are different dialects within languages. So there might be 2 people who spoke the same language on the cataloguing team. They're from different villages. And because they're from different villages, there might be slightly different forms in the languages that they use. So they would collaborate on that. They would share anecdotes about their 2 languages. The difference might be that in one dialect, they add a particular suffix or part of a word to different forms of their language. There was a dynamic of different dialects and how you can sort of share anecdotes, have a little laugh where the meaning changes. And there was a dynamic of the change in language over time. Some recordings from 50 years ago, a cataloguer might say, gee, I haven't heard that word for 50 years. I haven't heard that word since I was last talking to my grandparent in 1974 or something. So they are noticing that the language of, say, the 70s, the language that they grew up with, the language that was recorded in the 60s, and the language that is spoken today in community has changed, and the project is able to pick up on and record some of the changes and dynamics of the languages over time. The cataloguing project will play a key role in reviving language, because while the information and the digital files aren't available online at this stage, they will become available gradually over time to the community. So that's a whole other discussion that we'll be covering in a couple of seminars about what are the sharing processes and the rights processes that the project will undertake to get the results back to the community. So taking all of this into account, all of these different dynamics, some of the challenges and the diversity in language in the project, the CBC protocol is to use English to describe the stories that are told in the language. So the cataloguers will pick up a title, will review a title, and they're on the lookout for the stories that are included in any particular program or any particular recording. They will focus on the story and then document that story in the CBC catalogue. And they use English because the CBC database is built around using Roman scripts and the scripts that we are familiar with. This is the CBC article that I referred to earlier. Those are two screenshots of the indigenous version of the story and the English language version of the story. You can click backwards and forwards. Not all stories are posted in both languages. This is an example of where the CBC website has posted a story in the two languages. And you'll see there that the indigenous version has got 2 comments and the non-indigenous, the English version, has got no comments. It's something that we experience at Ngā Taonga, where we have different levels of engagement with Māori language social media posts and English language social media posts. So, I talked a little bit about dialect, and at Ngā Taonga, where I am involved in supporting some of our cataloguing work, we do take dialect into consideration. I've got a couple of examples here of slight variations in a word that are used in different places. While Māori share a common language across Aotearoa, which means that we essentially speak one language, there are variations in our vocab and some of our sentence structures. For example, there are a whole bunch of ways of saying, how are you? In Māori, you can say, how are you, about 8 different ways. And generally, the way that you ask that question will give an indicator of where you come from. So our approach to language and to dialect within Māori is to honour the voice of the speaker. We encourage our cataloguers to catalogue and capture the voice of the speaker. So if the person is saying wharenui, and they use the word tētahi, and they say tētahi wharenui, then we encourage our cataloguers to write tētahi wharenui. As somebody that is from Tainui and says tētahi, my kind of default way of writing tētahi is to write tētahi wharenui. But if I was cataloguing and if I heard tētahi wharenui, then I would default to the language of the speaker and use that. Similarly, I remember doing a social media post about Ngāti Raukawa. The post about Ngāti Raukawa used the word tipuna. My advice to the person developing that post was to write the word, to use tupuna, to use the Ngāti Raukawa version, or to use the word that I understand that they use in Ngāti Raukawa. So dialect is an issue in Māori cataloguing, and it's something that it's an issue for organisations to consider and to make decisions about the sort of style and the approach that they will take to using or not using Māori dialect. Make some final comments on Ngā Taonga and some of the considerations that we take in relation to using Māori dialect, and whether or not we standardise te reo Māori in our cataloguing, or whether or not we allow for variation, tribal variations in different words and sentence structures. We are guided by the orthographic conventions that were published by Te Taurewhiri Te Reo Māori. One of the things that we like about the orthographic conventions of Te Taurewhiri is that they're comprehensive. There's a lot of thought that's been put into the conventions by the mātangari, or by the language experts, and they're a useful guide for making decisions about words with double vowels, with single vowels, with dashes, with macrons. It's a one-stop shop for guidance about written Māori conventions. Te Mahi Krauna, it's useful to have Te Mahi Krauna, the Crown's Māori language strategy, that again lays out an approach and a framework for developing content in Māori, whether it's cataloguing or other content that heritage institutions may develop, such as bilingual communications or policy documentation, etc. And again, we support the use of, we encourage our cataloguers to capture the use of te reo as it is spoken by the speaker. In summary, to attend the CBC in Yellowknife was a real privilege. I found that there was so much that we have in common as peoples, and within that, there was so much that we had in common in relation to our cataloguing of our material that's spoken in indigenous language, and then the requirement that we have within our workplaces to document and to archive that material in te reo Māori in our case, and in the case of the CBC Indigenous Archiving Project, they're using English as the default language. Some of the dynamics and the challenges were similar in terms of capacity of finding the speakers, of engaging and maintaining the speakers and the staff, just the challenges of dealing with archival material itself. When it becomes mundane, you can have trouble keeping staff on board. The projects at CBC and in Ngā Taonga play a role in bridging the gap between kaumātua and mokopuna, the language of the kaumātua and the mokopuna of today, who may not have access to that reo and that kōrero other than through archival sources, and that's becoming increasingly the case within te ao Māori. The good news is that the projects are making the material findable. The metadata that's being added through these projects means that you can search for a person, search for a place, and search for an event, and across the board, it's becoming much easier to find that information. Nui hoki te manaaki o ngā iwira. It was a real privilege to be looked after by the whānau at the CBC Cataloguing project, and I would recommend such an exchange, and of course would look forward to a similar exchange, because before leaving I really did encourage them to make a trip to Aotearoa. They know where Aotearoa is now. They know a little bit about us as te iwi Māori and te ao Māori, and where Aotearoa is on the map. And so ultimately and ideally, it would be really a privilege to be able to host that group, should the whole COVID-19 thing calm down, and should they ever have the opportunity to come and visit us in Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, ko oti tēnei wāhanga. We're going to move to a sort of question and answer phase of this current. So yeah. We're going to move to a sort of question and answer phase of this current. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Gareth. That was just really interesting. I thought the similarities and differences were fascinating, and the role that cataloguing is playing in reviving Indigenous languages was exciting, and it was really heartwarming to hear that there was a bridging between kaumātua and mokopuna happening. I just thought that was great. I think if people have got questions now, maybe we can just take turns to unmute ourselves and ask questions. Thanks.
Kia ora, Gareth. This is Emma Jean here.
Kia ora.
That was really awesome. I was wondering, is the Yellowknife project a permanent project, or is it funded for a certain amount of time?
It's not permanent. It was made possible through a grant. I'm sorry, I don't know who the grant was made by, but it is a fixed term project of about 5 years or so. Oh. Yeah, I noticed that for a couple of, well, like a lot of Māori projects as well, for a couple of archiving projects that I was aware of while I was in Canada, that they had been funded by the national or the territorial, Indigenous cultural revitalisation body, or they were all being funded at different levels and at different stages.
Interesting, thank you.
Kia ora, Gareth.
Kia ora.
Can you share more about their kaitiaki, the way they're going to work through some of those kaupapa?
Sure thing. We do have a kaupapa about this in 4 weeks or so. But cut a long story short, I had an interesting session with the regional manager of CBC North, who is located in the office, who the project is aware that this is a significant issue for them. Their focus to date has been on the digitising and cataloguing aspect of the project, and they're just taking their first steps towards engaging with the tangata whenua, with the chiefs, the tribal councils, the clans, about the sharing, how they're going to manage the sharing aspect and the rights aspects of the project. An example would be, just to give an anecdote, in the conversation, the manager of the region talked about, well, how do you provide access to the titles within the rohe? If you can imagine this expansive rohe that doesn't necessarily have all of the access to the technology that would make access easy, would you locate some of the taonga at the local library or at the local tribal nations headquarters, and people would have to access it in those spaces? What if they haven't got good Wi-Fi connections? So yeah, there's a whole lot of questions, and they are starting to grapple with that kaupapa i naene.
Kia ora.
Kia no ngā pātai. Other questions and other comments or observations that might have come up in that presentation? I might throw a question to Sarah Johnston, one of my colleagues at Ngā Taonga. I might throw a question to Sarah Johnston, one of my colleagues at Ngā Taonga. Sarah, the question that I have for you is, you've been involved in caring for the Ngā Taonga kōrero collection for the time that you've been with RNZ and now with Ngā Taonga. What are some of the challenges that have arisen over the years in relation to dialect and to capturing and recording the metadata?
Kia ora, Gareth. I really enjoyed hearing that again. It was great. I think for us, capacity has definitely been an issue. You know, before the RNZ Sound Archives Ngā Taonga kōrero joined up in late 2012 with first the Film Archive and then became Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision. In 2014, you know, we hadn't had a Te Reo speaking cataloguer for a few years. And so, you know, there's a huge backlog of cataloguing work that needs doing. You know, we've got some outlines of all the historic RNZ programs in Te Reo Māori, but you know, there's a lot more work that could be done, and that includes taking into account different dialect differences. You know, we may have had just one cataloguer who spoke Te Reo Māori, and yet we have programs that include kōrero from, you know, all over the country. So yeah, it's that ongoing issue, really, isn't it? The more ears that can get to hear a recording and work on the description, the better, and that includes incorporating all the different meta and dialectical differences in the description. So I mean, it's been great since we've joined with Ngā Taonga that we now have more ears listening to all our Te Reo radio programming, and we're able to start including some of those regional and dialectical differences in the catalogue descriptions. The issue of access, I guess, is not as huge a problem for us, just because we're a smaller country, and there is wider access to the internet, but it still is an issue. I mean, I'm with my other hat on as a client access liaison. I know especially from a lot of our iwi Māori clients. You know, we have people who are based in, you know, more remote parts of Aotearoa, and they don't have reliable internet. And so, you know, we may have put a radio program online, an archived radio program, maybe online on our online database, so that people can listen to it. But, you know, where they are, they don't have reliable internet. So that definitely is still a problem here. And in particular, I think for some of our Māori clients.
Yeah, I mean, if I reflect on the team in Yellowknife, there were 8 languages. I think the number of cataloguers over time fluctuates, but as a minimum, you'd need 8 cataloguers, 1 for each language, if you were to deal equitably with all of the languages all of the time. If you have 2 cataloguers from a particular language, then that's a bonus. And of course, talking about those regional and those dialect variations where a person from one village and then the next village is 1,000 k's away. It's really hard to articulate the geography, but the geography, people are separated by snow. They may or may not be isolated during the winter and might not see each other for 6 months. There's all these dynamics of distance, of geography. Another anecdote that from the Institute headquarters or office of CBC North, 3,000 kilometres away, the reporter that is based there, should they want to do a story in another village, it's going to cost them $1,000 to get there because the flights are expensive and the flights are irregular. So how do they cover the stories of their people given some of those limitations? So yeah, there's a whole lot of dynamics, including dialect, as we're talking about now. So any other pātai, any other questions or observations about people, where they're working or about this project? About people, where they're working or about this project? Don't be shy, people. We've got another couple of minutes.
Well then,
Don't be shy, people. We've got another couple of minutes.
Oh, well, Imogen here again. I had a question about macrons. Imogen here again. I had a question about macrons and personal names.
Okay.
So, personal names. Yeah, so how do you deal with those issues in terms of whānau preference? Yeah, so how do you deal with those issues in terms of whānau preference?
That's a good question. That's a good question. The first part of the response is that we've got the orthographic conventions. The orthographics convention. The first part of the response is that we've got the orthographic conventions. The orthographics convention provided around the they suggest that people that have passed away, so they suggest that people that have passed away, the 1800s particularly, 1900s, and people that have passed away in the 1800s, macrons on names like, and people that have passed away macrons on names like, trying to think of another particular name that would have a macron in it. The name. Trying to think of another particular name that would have a macron in it. The name that are living. It's a mix. The guidance suggests that you don't use macrons. It's a mix. The guidance suggests that you don't have. There may be a preference. There may be a preference. You should not use a macron. You should not use a macron on.
Thank you. Thank you.
We acknowledge that we're part of a community of of people that are developing. We acknowledge that we're part of a community of Aotearoa Māoris, of people that are developing MCH and Aotearoa Māoris, archives, a community of practice around archives, the information community of practice around. Please stay in touch and the information that we've got, sharing these questions and please stay in touch and sharing the questions and these. Cool, Mutu Pea, is there one more question? Cool, Mutu Pea, is there one more question?
Thanks so much, Gareth. I just want to let everybody know that a recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel hopefully next week, and that Gareth will be holding 2 more webinars, April the 8th and April the 22nd. And I just want to say a huge thanks to you, Gareth. I thought that was really interesting. And if no one's got any more questions, I'll just leave it open just for a minute, just in case anyone thinks of anything else they want to ask.
In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about bilingual. Are we ready to provide bilingual services in Māori and English within our heritage institutions? So if you think about that for a couple of weeks and come back with your whakaaro, ka pai tērā. Wino tēnā koutou e whakarongo mai nā. I'll leave it for Helen to sign us all off.
Thanks so much, Gareth, and thank you everybody for joining us. And I hope that we'll see some more of you on April the 8th and April the 22nd. And good luck with all your working from home. I think that it's going to be a challenge for everybody, but it's really nice that we've got some of these online events that we can get together on. And I just want to also remind people that Leanne's is hosting every weekday. We've got a social get together. There's Zoom links on our social media channels, and you can just get together with colleagues around the country just to chat and share working from home tips or do the quiz or whatever you feel like if you want a bit of company. So yeah, that's it for me, and thanks a lot again, Gareth.
Ngā mihi kōrua.
Ka kite rā.